For the past century, human society has attempted to run its global economy on one of two incompatible operating systems. The first is the Marxist-inspired welfare state. It is a machine engineered to force equal outcomes by collecting and evenly redistributing resources to everyone. The second is the neoliberal free market. This engine strips away central control entirely, prioritizing maximum production and relentless economic growth. If you look strictly at the blueprints, both architectures are perfectly logical. Yet when deployed in the real world, both systems catastrophically fail. These failures are hardwired mathematical bugs, triggered the moment the systems interact with a single, unavoidable variable, human nature. Karl Marx laid the theoretical groundwork for the welfare state. His design relied on aggressively taxing the most successful producers to fund free collective services like healthcare and education for the entire population. Decades later, economists like Friedrich Hayek and the Austrian school drafted the opposing architecture. Hayek proposed removing the state apparatus entirely. In this model, private ownership of the means of production and unregulated markets are trusted to drive maximum economic output. Both architects made the same critical engineering error. They drafted blueprints that require human beings to change their natural behavior, rather than building a system that accommodates our inherent self-interest. To see why the welfare state breaks down, we can run a mechanical test. We start with wealth generation at the base layer, driven by the labor of producers. To achieve its goal of equality, this system requires a central state arbiter to collect that generated wealth and redistribute it evenly across the population. The mechanical failure occurs precisely where the generated wealth passes directly through the hands of that human arbiter. Whoever controls the flow of resources inevitably takes a cut. We call this arbitration corruption. This creates a mathematical paradox. The more aggressively the state attempts to redistribute resources, the more it enriches an insulated, corrupt administrative class. The Marxist model breaks under its own weight because it replaces market-driven inequality with bureaucratic extortion. The welfare state also triggers a second, highly predictable mechanical reaction. Successful entrepreneurs actively resist being penalized for their labor and risk. Rather than surrender the majority of their income to the arbiter, wealth creators utilize legal mechanisms to move their assets out of the taxing authority's jurisdiction. This is known as capital flight. When France attempted to tax extreme wealth at high rates, high net worth individuals, like actor Gerard Depardieu, acquired citizenship in other countries to protect their capital. That capital flows into a vast, parallel global network of low-tax jurisdictions engineered specifically to catch this financial exodus. It moves into established offshore shelters in the Caribbean. It flows into highly developed corporate havens in Asia. It settles in zero-tax enterprise zones in Middle Eastern hubs. And it pools in financial shelters operating right in the center of Europe. As long as a state aggressively taxes production, capital will simply vanish through these structural pipes, mathematically starving the welfare system of the funds it needs to operate. If we sweep the board clean and test the pure free market engine, we see a completely different set of mechanics at play. Without the slow friction of a central state bureaucracy, this new machine produces resources at an immense, entirely unregulated speed. The engine undeniably succeeds at its primary function. It creates a significantly larger gross domestic product, or GDP, than any centralized system. This chart reveals the fatal data flaw in the free market model. Average GDP shoots upward, but median wealth, the financial baseline for the middle worker, stalls or declines. The total economic pie is expanding rapidly, but the slice going to the typical worker mathematically shrinks. The neoliberal model successfully removes the corruption of the state arbiter, only to introduce a new, equally destructive mechanical bug in its place. The free market engine is highly efficient at generating wealth, but it is structurally blind to that wealth pooling at the very top of the system. That pooling occurs because the system lacks the ability to distinguish between different types of market participants. The first participant is the value creator. This is the entrepreneur who builds infrastructure, employs workers, and generates new wealth for the economy. We see this archetype in the technology founders, who develop new industries from the ground up. The second participant is the value extractor. This is the pure speculator who produces nothing, moving capital into short-term volatility and leverage trades. This is the passive market participant who amasses capital strictly by extracting value from others' labor during moments of price fluctuation. In a pure free market, this speculative capital naturally pools in unsustainable asset bubbles. When the leverage becomes too heavy to support, it triggers a cyclical crisis. When those bubbles burst, wealth isn't destroyed, it is transferred from the liquidated working class to the cash-rich speculators who waited for the bottom. Pure neoliberalism eventually destabilizes society because its underlying math inherently rewards passive extraction over actual production. The final engineering challenge is to build a machine that harnesses the wealth-generating gears of the free market, but includes a mechanism to ensure that wealth distributes fairly. We can call this synthesized blueprint social liberalism. To construct it, we extract the functional, intact components from the two broken systems and integrate them into a single, unified architecture. The first rule of this new machine is that it must retain the core neoliberal engine. It has to incentivize free market entrepreneurship without penalizing the people taking the actual financial risks. The second rule is a total rejection of the Marxist human bureaucracy. The system must permanently eliminate the state arbiter to prevent resources from being siphoned off by administrative friction. To remove corruption while maintaining a fair distribution of capital, human decision-makers have to be replaced by automated, hardwired mathematical constraints. We execute this by re-engineering the tax code. Instead of acting as a blunt instrument to punish overall success, the code operates as a mechanical governor, explicitly targeting and restricting passive speculation. Inside the engine, this mathematical limiter blocks capital extraction by speculators, while allowing active value creators to spin without heavy taxation. Capital normally day traded on the stock market is instead routed directly back into physical production. This physically solves the capital flight leak. Because long-term value creation is no longer penalized, offshore tax havens become mathematically unnecessary for the people actually building the economy. The synthesized machine runs without jamming. Wealth generates rapidly and cascades evenly across the societal tiers, requiring zero human intervention to sort it. A functional economic architecture cannot rely on altering human nature. The perfect economic machine works precisely because it accepts human self-interest as a constant and channels it as the fuel to power the progress of the entire society.